She knocked on my door at 11 minutes past 11 on a Saturday night in October. I know it was 11 minutes past because I looked at the clock on the microwave the moment I heard it. 3 solid raps. Not timid, not frantic, just certain. The way someone knocks when they've made a decision and are committed to it. I had been sitting at my kitchen table with a book I wasn't reading and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. And the knock was so unexpected in the silence of that house that I sat there for a full 3 seconds before I stood up. When I opened the door, Clara Weston was standing on my porch in a wedding dress. Not the metaphorical kind of statement. An actual wedding dress. Ivory lace, fitted through the bodice and structured at the waist. The skirt gathered slightly at the hem from where she'd been walking. Her dark hair was still pinned up in the loose, elegant arrangement someone had spent an hour building that morning. Though several pieces had come free and were falling soft across her jaw and her throat. There was a tiny piece of confetti, pale gold, shaped like a star, caught just above her right ear. Her mascara had tracked once, faintly, beneath her left eye, and then she had stopped it. She was still wearing her heels. She was holding her small ivory evening bag by one white-knuckled hand. She looked at me for exactly 1 second. The kind of second where someone is confirming something they'd been arguing with themselves about the entire drive over. And then she said, in a voice that was steady in the way a voice gets when the person behind it has already used up everything shaking. I didn't know where else to go. I want to tell you that I immediately understood everything and said something calm and useful. I want to tell you I was the kind of man who knew what to do when something this unexpected landed on his doorstep. The truth is, I stood there for 4 full seconds, and the only thought my brain produced was, whatever happened tonight. It happened fast, and it was bad. I stepped back. I said, "Come in." And she did. But you can't understand that night without understanding the 4 years that built up to it. You can't understand why she came here, of all the people she could have called, of all the safe houses in the town full of people who knew her name, without knowing who Garrett Holly is and what Clara Weston had meant to him long before he ever opened that door. So let me take you back to the beginning, because that's where this really starts. My name is Garrett Holly. I'm 31 years old, and I live in Cedar Bluff, North Carolina, which is a small town in the western part of the state where the mountains start pushing up and the roads get narrow, and the autumn turns the hills into something that has no good description for anyone who hasn't seen it. I own a small contracting business, just me and 2 part-time guys on most jobs. Nothing that makes anyone rich, but work I'm proud of because it's honest and it lasts. I build things that hold. I fix things other people have let fall apart. I've always been better with structures than with people. I've always been bit people, which is something my father said about himself and which I inherited without meaning to. I live in a craftsman house on Elm Street that I bought 5 years ago when it was one bad winter away from being unsalvageable. Oh, and I've put enough of my own hours into it that every wall in the place knows my hands. The floors are old pine, warm under bare feet. The kitchen has a window above the sink that looks out at a white oak tree that's been in that yard longer than the house has been standing. I like living somewhere with that kind of history underneath it. History in a place is different from weight. It's not pressing down. It's just there, below the surface, the way good foundations always are. I don't have a dramatic story. My parents are alive and still married. I was an average student. Finished community college for construction management, came home and started working. I dated a woman named Amy for about 8 months 2 years ago, and it ended the way quiet things end, not with one big rupture, just with the gradual recognition that being together took more than it gave. I didn't fall apart over it. I got quieter for a while and then got back to work. The life I had in Cedar Bluff was a good one. Simple, yes. A little small maybe, but real. And for a long time, I told myself real was enough, which is the thing we tell ourselves when we're not quite ready to admit what we actually want. Clara Weston came into my life 4 years ago through a mutual friend who was organizing a restoration project for an old commercial building on Main Street, a 1920s brick storefront that had been empty for years and was finally getting attention. Clara had moved back to Cedar Bluff from Charlotte after her father had a health scare, and she'd been asked to handle the signage and visual identity work. I was there to assess the structural needs and oversee the renovation. We spent about 3 months in that building together, measuring walls, arguing about load-bearing decisions, making calls about what to preserve and what had to come down. It turned into something I hadn't planned for and couldn't quite define. Not a relationship. Nothing happened, nothing was said. Just a specific ease between 2 people that doesn't come along often, and that I recognized immediately as something worth paying attention to. She laughed at things I said when I wasn't trying to be funny. I could say something quietly from across the room, and she'd hear it. She had the habit of tilting her head slightly when she was working through a problem, and I started finding reasons to present her with complicated decisions just to watch her do it. None of this was appropriate, because by the 3rd week I knew she was in a serious relationship. His name was Donovan Price. He'd grown up in Cedar Bluff, moved to Charlotte for finance, come back with money and the kind of composed self-assurance that money builds in people who were already inclined that direction. Good-looking in a polished, deliberate way. The kind of man who knew exactly how he appeared to any room and managed that appearance with practiced ease. Clara had been with him for almost a year when I met her. I stepped back. That's the simple version. I recognized what I was feeling, looked at the situation, and decided to respect the line that was already drawn. Not because I'm noble, because I'm sensible, and because wanting something you can't have with clean hands is a waste of good energy. There was one afternoon near the end of the project when Clara and I were the last 2 in the building. Everyone else had gone. The late light was coming through the old windows at an angle that made the dust in the air look like something gold and suspended. And she was standing at the far end of the room looking up at the exposed brick we'd decided to keep. And she said without turning around, "This is the best part. When something old gets to just be what it always was, instead of what someone tried to make it into." I said something back. I don't remember exactly what. She turned and smiled at me across the room, and I thought, clearly and without drama, I am in real trouble here. And then I thought, and there's not a single thing I can do about it. Because there wasn't. So I stepped back. Clara and I stayed friendly. We saw each other at mutual gatherings and were easy together in the way people are, when something almost happened and both of them handled it like adults. I moved on. Gradually, carefully, the way you move on from something you never allowed yourself to fully name in the first place. When I heard they were engaged last spring, I felt something I didn't examine too closely, and then I went back to work. I told myself the chapter was closed. I believed it, mostly. The wedding had been set for the first Saturday of October. Everyone in Cedar Bluff knew about it. Donovan Price was not the kind of man who allowed significant events in his life to go unannounced. I hadn't been invited, which was the appropriate outcome and the one I'd expected. I spent that Saturday on a kitchen addition for a client across town, came home, cleaned up, made dinner, and settled in for a quiet evening that felt no different from any other. And then came 3 knocks at 11 minutes past 11 dot. She was still in the heels when I led her to the kitchen. The old pine floors made a different sound under them, formal, slightly out of place, like a wrong note in a familiar piece of music. I didn't comment on it. I put the kettle on. She stood in the middle of the kitchen with her arms slightly away from her sides, the posture of someone who isn't sure whether they're allowed to be comfortable. And she looked around the room with the careful, Slightly unfocused attention of someone whose mind is still processing something enormous. The confetti star was still in her hair. I didn't mention it. "Sit down," I said. She sat. I set a mug of chamomile in front of her. It was the only thing I had that felt right for 11 at night, and whatever had happened, and I sat across from her and waited. There's a kind of patience that isn't passive. It's just the recognition that some things come out in their own time, and that pushing shortens the telling without improving it. She didn't speak for a long while. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the steam rising off it. The kitchen light caught the lace across her shoulders and the small pearl earrings she was still wearing. And I thought, not for the first time, that Clara Weston was the kind of person whose beauty had nothing to do with effort. It just existed. Like something in the architecture of her, and no amount of stress or late hours or one terrible evening could do much about it. "His name is on a lease," she said finally. "An apartment in Charlotte, with a woman named Rachel." She paused. "He's been paying her rent for 2 years. Another pause. "She came to the church tonight. She didn't know about me. I didn't know about her. We found out at the same time in the vestibule while Donovan was waiting at the altar." She said it without inflection. That flat, careful tone that people use when they are holding something so heavy that any variation in their voice might make them drop it. "He proposed to her 3 months ago, while I was picking centerpieces for our wedding. I didn't say anything." She looked up at me. "My mother thinks I overreacted. She called me twice in the car." I looked at her. "What did you tell her?" I didn't answer. A pause. "I drove for about 20 minutes without really knowing where I was going. And then I ended up on your street." She said it simply, not as confession, not as apology, just as a fact being reported. I sat in the car for a while. I almost didn't knock. "But you knocked," I said. "Yeah," she said. I knocked. And we sat with that for a moment, both of us, because there was more in those words than either of us was ready to open up just yet. I showed her the guest room. I found an old flannel shirt and drawstring sweatpants and left them folded outside the door without explanation, because explaining the gesture would have made it heavier than it needed to be. When she came out 20 minutes later, her hair was down, all the pins removed. Dark waves falling past her shoulders, and she was wearing the flannel and sweatpants, and the wedding dress was folded neatly over the back of the hallway chair. She looked younger. She looked like someone I recognized in a way that had nothing to do with 4 years of knowing her name. Something older than that. Something I filed away and didn't examine. "Thank you," she said, "for the clothes, and for not asking me everything at once. The rest can wait," I said. "Tonight you just need somewhere quiet to be." She nodded. She went back to the room. I heard the door close softly, and then the house was still, and I stood in the hallway, looking at the wedding dress on that chair for a long time. In the morning, she was already up when I came downstairs. She was at the kitchen table with both hands around a cup of coffee she'd made herself, quietly, without leaving any trace of the process except the full pot and one clean mug. She was looking out at the white oak in the backyard. She had the stillness of someone who has been awake for hours and has thought herself into a particular kind of calm that isn't peace exactly, but is the territory just adjacent to it. The flannel shirt fell to mid-thigh, and her hair was loose around her shoulders. And she looked out at that tree with an expression I couldn't categorize. Not lost, not recovered, just honestly somewhere in between. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the faint cool of the October air coming under the back door. The morning light made the old pine floors look like they'd been polished. "You slept," I said, more statement than question. "A little," she said. "Enough." She watched me pour my coffee. Neither of us spoke for a minute. Then, "I have about 40 messages from people I don't want to talk to." "How many from people you do?" She thought about it. 1. My friend Jessie. She's the only voice I want right now. Call her, I said. I'll make eggs. She looked at me, the way people look when something simple lands harder than it should, right in the middle of a morning when they needed exactly that. Then she picked up her phone. Jessie arrived at 10. She was a compact woman with quick movements and a voice that had its own weather system. And she came through my front door like someone who had been moving fast for an hour and wasn't planning to slow down soon. She held Clara for a long time without saying anything, and then she pulled back and looked at her. And then she said, flatly, I will destroy him. Jessie, Clara said. I'll do it very calmly, Jessie said. She looked at me with the assessing attention of someone taking inventory. Who are you? Garrett Holly. I live here. Right. 3 seconds of evaluation. Good, she decided and sat down. The three of us spent the better part of 2 hours going through everything Clara knew. Jessie had already spoken to someone at the church, a bridesmaid who'd been standing nearby when Rachel arrived. The story was already moving through Cedar Bluff, the way stories move through small towns. Fast and in every direction simultaneously. Donovan was managing it. He was telling people that Clara had an episode, that word specifically, the kind of word that sounds concerned and cuts like a knife, that she'd been under stress, that it wasn't what it looked like. He was, apparently, a man who understood that if you can get your version out first, the facts have a harder time finding traction. That information settled into me like something cold. I knew that type of management. I'd seen it in construction. Clients who covered structural damage with cosmetics until the ceiling came down, and then stood in the rubble and insisted they'd had no warning. What does he want? I asked. Clara looked at me. He called this morning. He wants to talk. Of course, Jessie said. He wants to get in front of the story. My mother thinks I should meet with him, Clara said. Jessie's expression did several things at once. I know, Clara said, before Jessie could say any of them. I know. He came to my door at 2:30 that afternoon. I hadn't expected that. I assumed he'd try Jessie's place, or wait for Clara to surface somewhere more predictable. But someone in Cedar Bluff had told him where she was, and Donovan Price arrived at my door, dressed as if he'd had a full night of sleep, and this was just a thing he was handling on a Sunday. Still polished, still managed. But underneath it, the particular quality of a man who is accustomed to controlling a room and has just discovered the room isn't responding. I stood in the doorway and did not invite him in. He looked past me first, then back at me. She's here, he said. She is, I said. I need to speak with her. Then you should call her and ask if that's something she wants. He looked at me then, the real kind, assessing. You're Garrett Holly, he said. The way he said my name told me she had mentioned me at some point in 4 years. What she'd said, I had no way of knowing. But he knew who I was. I am, I said. He held eye contact for a moment longer than was comfortable. This isn't what it looks like, he said. I thought about Rachel, about an apartment lease, about a proposal made while someone else was choosing what flowers would stand at the altar. I think, I said quietly, that it's exactly what it looks like. Something behind his expression shifted then, not collapse. Just a rearrangement of something he'd been presenting, into something more like what was actually underneath it. I'd be careful, he said. Not raised. Very precise. Small towns talk. You might want to think about what they'll say about you in this particular story. I didn't answer him. I closed the door. I stood with my hand on the latch and let what he'd said settle into me fully, because you can't respond to something well if you haven't let yourself understand it first. He was going to make me part of the story. He was going to reframe Clara's leaving as something that was about me rather than about him. Him was going about him. And in a town this size, a story told first is a story told loudest. I didn't tell Clara immediately. She'd heard the car in the driveway and gone very still in the kitchen. And when I came back and I said, "He's gone," and she exhaled once quietly and looked back at her coffee. She didn't ask what we talked about. I think she already knew the shape of it. But that evening, after Jessie had left and the house was dark outside, and Clara and I were sitting on the back porch in the October cold with the oak tree moving above us and the night smelling like pine and damp leaves and the particular sharpness of early autumn in the mountains. I told her everything, every word of it, with nothing softened. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "He's going to say it was you, that I left because of something between us." "Yeah," I said. I figured that. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Garrett, I need you to know that I came here because you're someone I trust, not because of anything else. I didn't want to drag you into this." I looked at the yard. The grass was pale in the moonlight. "I know that," I said. And then, before I'd made a deliberate decision about it, the thing I'd been keeping carefully behind a door for 4 years came out. Not dramatically, just simply the way truth sounds when it's been waiting long enough. "But you should know that the reason I trust you being here, the reason I'm not walking past any of this, is that I've been paying attention to you since the 3rd week I knew you. I stepped back 4 years ago because the situation was what it was, and stepping back was right. But I've been doing it ever since. And I'm telling you this now because if he's going to build a story about what I mean to you, you should know the truth of it first, so you can decide what you want." The oak tree moved. Somewhere down the street, a car went past slowly, headlights sweeping across the fence. Clara didn't say anything for a long time. Long enough that I thought I'd chosen the wrong moment entirely and made something complicated even harder. Then she said, very quietly, "I used to think about you. After we met, I'd think, what if the timing had been different? What would that have looked like?" A pause. I talked myself out of it. Told myself I was just comfortable around you and was confusing it for something else. Comfort isn't the same as love. I knew that. Another pause, shorter. "But I didn't think about Donovan the way I thought about you. I never had. I spent 4 years pretending I didn't know what that meant." I turned to look at her. She was looking at the yard, her jaw set the way it gets when she's made a decision she's going to keep. "I'm raw right now," I said. "Everything about you is raw. I don't want to be something that happened because a terrible night left the door open." She turned then, looked straight at me. "Don't manage this," she said. "Don't decide for me what I'm capable of knowing right now." I held her eyes. "Okay," I said. "Okay." She looked back at the yard. Neither of us moved, and the October night held us there, cold and quiet and enormous, while something new and terrifyingly real took its first full breath. The following week was hard in the specific way. Small-town life is hard when a story is moving faster than the facts. Donovan's version was traveling. He used the word struggling when he talked about Clara, deliberately, because it's the kind of word that sounds compassionate and functions as damage. He didn't name me out loud. In Cedar Bluff, he didn't need to. Clara's mother called and left 2 messages about reputation and the importance of private resolution. Clara didn't return them. Jessie was handling the factual record with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for a reason. She posted nothing inflammatory. She posted a copy of the apartment lease. She posted Rachel's statement, which Rachel gave willingly because Rachel was living through her own version of this catastrophe and had no interest whatsoever in protecting Donovan Price from its consequences. Clara spent 4 days at my house. Then she stayed with Jessie for a week. Then she found a short-term rental while she dealt with the apartment she'd shared with Donovan, which had been in both their names and required several unpleasant conversations she had mostly over email. She came over for dinner most evenings. We built something slowly, with the kind of care that both of us understood was necessary. I am, after all, a man who makes his living building things. I know the difference between a foundation that's been allowed to cure properly and one that's been rushed. We ate dinner at the kitchen table and talked for hours, not about Donovan, not about the wedding, but about real things, her work, the designs she loved, and the clients who made her want to quit on Wednesdays, the graphic novels she collected and organized by a system nobody else was permitted to touch, my work, the houses I'd loved, and the ones that had broken my heart with what had been done to them. We went slowly, we went carefully, and every evening when she left, I stood at the front door for a moment after her car pulled away and felt the house settle back into its quiet, and thought about how different quiet felt now that I knew what it was. The absence of Dot. One evening, she arrived with her laptop and spread it on the kitchen table and worked while I cooked, because she had a deadline, and I told her she didn't have to choose between the two. I watched her from across the kitchen, not in a way she knew, just the kind of watching you do from the corner of your eye when something is exactly where it should be, and you don't want to make it self-conscious by noticing it too directly. She had her dark hair pulled over one shoulder, and she was chewing the inside of her lip, the way she does when she's making a visual decision, and the kitchen light was warm on her face. And I thought about the first time I'd noticed that expression 4 years ago, in a cold building on Main Street, and told myself to step back. I thought about all the evenings of not being here. Then I went back to the stove and didn't say anything, because some things don't need to be said out loud to be understood completely. She looked up once and caught me half watching and didn't say anything either, but the corner of her mouth moved. And I turned back to what I was doing with the particular awareness of a man who was just confirmed something he'd been mostly certain about for a long time. 3 weeks after she knocked on my door, Donovan Price's version of events stopped having momentum. Rachel's statement had been enough on its own. 2 of his Charlotte colleagues had added their own observations, first privately, then less so, about patterns of behavior they'd watched accumulate over years. The polish comes off all at once when the first layer goes, and what was underneath Donovan Price turned out to be a fairly ordinary man who had systematically overestimated his own ability to manage consequences. Cedar Bluff adjusted its opinion the way small towns always do, collectively, and quickly, with the quiet acknowledgement that it had been misled and was not planning to dwell on the fact. His name stopped traveling through conversations. He became someone people described in the past tense. Clara's mother called on a Thursday afternoon and said she was sorry. Not in a complicated way, just plainly, the way apologies sound when someone has thought them through until they mean something. Clara told me about it standing in my kitchen that evening, leaning against the counter with her arms folded and her eyes bright in a way that was close to tears and slightly beyond them. She said she worried more about what it looked like than what it felt like, Clara said. She said she forgot to just ask me if I was okay. She looked at me. I told her I was more okay than I'd been in a year. I nodded. She looked at her hands for a moment. She asked where I was staying. A pause. I said I was in a friend's house. The word friend landed between us. Clara smiled. The real one. The one that reaches the eyes and stays. She said she hoped he was worth keeping. I looked at her. What did you tell her? I told her. She said that he builds things that last. 6 months after that October night, the wedding dress was long gone, given to a consignment shop in Asheville that specialized in vintage gowns, because Clara said it deserved a better story than the one it had been part of. The graphic design studio she'd been running from home got a real address when she signed a lease on a small space on Main Street, the same block where we'd first met, in the same building my crew had renovated 4 years ago. I did the fit-out work myself, and I may have taken more care with those walls than the contract required. I replaced the old single-pane windows with ones that let more light in. I built her a drafting desk from reclaimed pine that matched the floors. I didn't tell her it was reclaimed from the same building. She figured it out when she ran her hand across the surface one afternoon and asked about the color of the grain. And then she was quiet for a moment and looked at me in a way that had everything in it that needed to be said. My neighbor Warren, who had lived 3 houses down on Elm Street for 30 years and watched me rebuild this place from the studs up, stopped me one morning while we were both getting the mail. He said Clara reminded him of something. I asked him what. He said, "This house." Something that was always worth the work. Just needed the right person to stop walking past it. I didn't have a response for that. He went inside looking satisfied. Cedar Bluff moved on from the story, the way small towns eventually move on from everything, not forgetting exactly, but folding it into the ordinary texture of a place that has seen enough years to know that people are complicated, and that life is longer than any single event in it. Donovan Price was no longer a presence in our conversations. He had become someone spoken of occasionally in the past tense, like a thing that had happened and been handled and was done. Rachel, who had also been wronged, had moved back to where she was from, and the last anyone heard she was doing better. Clara's mother came to visit in December and stayed for a weekend, and I cooked dinner for them both on Saturday night. And her mother sat at my kitchen table and looked around the room with the careful attention of a woman, reassessing her own conclusions. And at the end of the meal, she said to Clara, quietly, while I was at the sink, that the house felt like somewhere a person could breathe. I didn't say anything, but I heard it. There's a photograph on my kitchen windowsill now, tucked against the glass where the morning light hits it. Jesse took it on a Sunday in early spring when the 3 of us had been out on one of the trails above town. Clara is looking at something off to the left and laughing, whatever it was. It was worth looking at. And her hair is loose in the wind, and she's wearing a green jacket over a fitted cream sweater, and she looks more like herself than any version of herself I ever saw before the night she knocked on my door. I look at it some mornings when I'm making coffee before she's awake. I think about the 4 years of stepping back, of maintaining a careful distance, of telling myself sensible was the same as right. I think about all the evenings I left early from whatever gathering she was at, because staying felt like a risk I hadn't earned the right to take. And then I think about 3 knocks on a door at 11 minutes past 11. About a woman standing on my porch in a wedding dress, still in her heels, a gold confetti star in her dark hair, holding herself together with both hands. About how she looked at me for 1 second to confirm I was real, and then said the truest thing she had. I didn't know where else to go. I'm not a man who gives long speeches. I don't have a dramatic account of the moment I knew. What I have is this: a house that doesn't feel like the absence of something anymore. A woman who comes home most evenings and takes off her shoes at the door and says something about her day before she's even fully inside, and means it the way you only mean things when you've stopped performing them. An oak tree in the backyard that's been standing longer than either of us has been alive. That doesn't need a reason to stay where it is. That just stands there because that's what it does, and has been doing it since before anyone thought to ask. If you've ever felt something real for someone and talked yourself out of it because the timing was wrong, or the lines were already drawn, or you told yourself you were being sensible when what you were actually being was afraid. If you've ever stood on your side of a careful distance and watched someone stand on theirs and done what was reasonable when every instinct said otherwise, then you understand exactly what I mean. When I say that the night Clara Weston knocked on my door at 11 minutes past 11, I didn't feel like a man who was doing something brave. I felt like a man who had finally stopped, stepping back at exactly the right moment. Because sometimes the thing you've been protecting isn't something you need to protect anymore. And sometimes the right move isn't a move at all. Sometimes it's just opening the door, putting the kettle on, and saying, "Come in." Whatever happened tonight, you don't have to be alone in it. And trusting that everything else will find its shape from there.